Today we're going to be talking about a paper by Elizabeth Kensinger called Negative Emotion Enhances Memory Accuracy. My name is Petra Tocheva, and let's get started. The main question Kensinger is tackling in the study is whether or not emotional memories are immune to disruption. What Kensinger really wants to figure out is whether emotion enhances the way we remember things or if it simply adds biases that ultimately change our memories. The first example Kensinger uses to answer her questions is a study she conducted in 2006. Participants were given items to study that sparked different emotions. A few weeks later, they were called back and given new objects. They were asked which objects are similar to the previous ones they were given. Participants were better at describing the details of the negative objects more than the others. That proves Kensinger's point that negative emotions are more likely to boost people's memories of certain events, items, or even places. She did a similar analysis where she showed people different negative items, in this case animals, against neutral backgrounds, and compared the responses to neutral objects against neutral backgrounds. For example, the monkey in this case would be neutral, because it does not directly incite fear in people as much as a snake does. Later in the study, when people were asked to recall the backgrounds of the photos, including the negative objects, they couldn't. They had focused most of their attention on the item that induced some sort of fear, which showed that participants are strongly attracted to the emotion-inducing item and forget the most peripheral aspects. Another example Kensinger uses to answer her question is a study from 2006 where she used fMRIs to image the brain activity of participants. They found that the amygdala and orbital frontal cortex were able to correlate to a more accurate memory of negative items than for neutral items. This is important because the orbital frontal cortex and amygdala are regions that play a role in emotional information processing. These regions interacted with the hippocampus, a part of the brain responsible for memory. This connection supports the idea that when memories are formed, we remember better when they trigger our emotions, specifically negative emotions. This emotion-memory tie makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. For example, when an animal is in danger, they are likely to remember that situation vividly and refrain from getting into a similar situation in the future, due to these negative memory tags. Kensinger also references a 2004 study by Levine and Bluck. They used the O.J. Simpson trial as an example of how positive or negative emotions affect memory. When people were satisfied with the outcome of the trial, they seemed to distort certain aspects and details of the trial. However, when people were displeased with the verdict of the trial, they appeared to remember details of the trial more accurately. Interestingly, when questioned on their confidence in their memories, the people who had distorted memories were very confident in their answers. The result of this study demonstrates the phenomenon of negative emotions yielding more accurate memories with fewer reconstructive memory errors. The paper was really about the effect of emotions on memory encoding. Kensinger talked about how she used her studies and those of other researchers as evidence that this phenomenon exists, thereby setting up researchers to figure out the why. Why do we process negative memories in more detail? So, after all of this, what's wrong with this paper? Well, for one, it's too complicated. Singer was trying to bring in way too many variables to support her point. Not only was she referencing and citing sources from 1977, but she was also bringing up studies that her and her colleagues did in 2005. She never labeled her study as a meta-analysis, so I was a bit confused when I was reading her paper because I thought that I was reading a new study that she was conducting. Another issue I had with this paper was that the graphs were not labeled correctly. She was using the graphs to demonstrate her takeaways from previous studies, but they were very confusing upon first glance. The middle graph, for example, has a diagonal line with an asterisk, and nowhere does she explain what that connection means. In the graph to the right, she was recording the outcomes of one of her studies, which was done at different points in time, but you cannot tell which graph represents which time period. Graphs should be able to stand on their own, and they should be objects of clarity. They shouldn't cause more confusion. Overall, There was no major conclusion to her whole study. It was very much a commonsensical thing, and something that we can all agree happens. Her objective was more to show how she knew that negative emotions impacted memory formation, through the use of her examples. Even though this paper was a bit confusing, what Kensinger was saying can be applied to training and development. But how? For example, Kensinger states, the valence of an event seems to be a critical determinant of the accuracy with which the event is remembered, with negative events being remembered in greater detail than positive ones. Valence in this case is value, or whether or not something is pleasurable. But what does this mean for T&D? It means that when you are a trainer trying to teach someone how to do a job, you have to keep it simple. You want to limit the emotional noise when it comes to teaching so that people retain as much information about the job as possible. Similarly, Kensinger states, negative emotions can lead to fewer reconstructive memory errors than positive emotion, consistent with evidence that individuals in a negative mood process information in an analytical, detailed fashion, whereas people in a positive mood ignore the details. And how does this relate to T&D? Similar to the other point. When trainers are creating programs, they have to be objective, factual, and concrete so that they can avoid emotion as much as possible. In that way, trainees can absorb information and be less affected by the emotional aspects of what they're learning. Let's think back to the study where Kensinger put a negative object against a neutral background. Do you remember? How does that relate to T&D? Well, when Kensinger asked people to describe what was behind that scary image, most people didn't remember. Why? Because humans aren't good multitaskers. So, when developing training programs, it's important to make sure they're simple so people can pay attention to what's most important. Kensinger's main point was that we tend to remember negative interactions, items, and places in more detail than positive ones. In terms of a job environment, this phenomenon can be very unpleasant. So, as an organization, it's important to, of course, try and reduce negativity, but most importantly, not to make people feel bad for making mistakes. It's important for organizations to be learning environments so that they encourage more growth.